Welcome back to Inside the Philippines. If you've been with us for a while, you know the kinds of stories we tell here. Men who moved too fast, trusted too easily, spent too much. Men who got dazzled by the heat and the warmth and the attention and forgot to ask the obvious questions until it was too late. We've told a lot of those stories, but today's story is a bit different. Today's protagonist didn't move too fast. He wasn't reckless. He didn't blow his life savings chasing a fantasy or fall for some elaborate online romance with a woman who turned out to be 3D. He did, by most reasonable measures, almost everything right. His name is Ciaran Moloy. He's 52 years old, from County Roscommon originally, most recently from Clondalkin in Dublin, spent 30 years working construction, laborer, then foreman. A man who built things for a living and measured himself by whether the job got done properly. He came to the Philippines for what he'd tell you was a rest. He met someone. The relationship was quiet and real and domestic, and for a while it was exactly what he needed. And then he ended it. Calmly. And that is when things got very complicated indeed. This one's going to stay with you. Not because of what she did, but because of what the law did. And because if you're in a relationship in the Philippines right now, any relationship, any stage, what Ciaran learned the hard way is something you genuinely need to hear. Here's his story, in his own words. Right. So, I need to go back a bit. Because none of it makes sense without the before. And the before is, it's not a happy story either, to be fair. I worked construction my whole life. Started at 19, laboring for a block-laying crew in Athlone. Ended up site foreman for a mid-sized contractor out of Dublin. 30 years. I know how to read a drawing, manage a crew, keep a schedule. I know when concrete's wrong by the smell of it. That's not boasting, that's what I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. That's who I am. Was. Whatever. I married Sinead in 2007. Yeah, I know. He got the name. And Ayoife in 2009. We had a house in Clondalkin, a semi-D. Nothing spectacular, but it wasn't a glamorous life, but it was solid. Or I thought it was solid. Turns out I hadn't been paying close enough attention. She started going to this gym in Talit in 2021. Good for her, I thought. She seemed happier. She was losing a bit of weight, dressing a bit differently. I put it down to post-lockdown. Everyone was a bit odd coming out of that. I put it down to a lot of things. And then one evening in March of 2022, she sat down at the kitchen table and told me she'd been seeing someone. Had been for about 4 months. My first reaction, and I'm not proud of this, was that I nearly laughed. Not because it was funny, because the sheer bloody cliché of it was almost more than I could process. 19 years, 2 kids, and the man who replaced me earns a living by being physically impressive, which after 30 years of site work, I am, not my body is functional. Let's leave it there. She was gone within 6 weeks. Moved out with the kids to her mother's in Talit first, then into a rental. CRNG was 17 by then. Ayoife was 15. They stayed with her. I'd collect them on Saturday morning, and they'd sit in the car with the energy of people doing something they'd been asked to do. Not cruel, just elsewhere. Kids that age have their own lives and their own embarrassments, and their father's the man who wasn't interesting enough to keep their mother. I don't blame them for any of that. I'm just telling you what it felt like. The house went on the market in the autumn. We split it clean, which is the one thing I'll give her credit for. No games with the lawyers, no drawn-out performance. My half, after fees and everything, came to just under €155,000. I sat in my new one-bedroom flat in Crumlin, rented, obviously, because you can't buy anything in Dublin for what I had, and looked at the number in my bank app. More money than I'd ever had in one place in my life. And I want you to understand something about that. about having more money than you've ever had and still feeling like you have absolutely nothing. I wasn't depressed, officially. I've never been a man who goes to the doctor about feelings, which my daughter has opinions on, and she's probably right. But I was. Hollow is the word. I'd come home to the flat after work and there'd be nothing to do. I'd eaten. I'd watched whatever was on. I had nowhere to be. The weekends. I didn't have the kids. I didn't know what to do with myself. I'd drive out to Clondalkin sometimes, not to the old street, just around the area, not even sure why. Muscle memory, maybe? My brother-in-law Declan, that's my sister Orla's husband, a solid fella, electrician by trade, he'd done a few months working on a fit-out project in Cebu the previous year. He wasn't evangelical about it. Declan's not that kind of man. He just mentioned it a few times when we'd have a pint. Said the cost of living was remarkable. Said the people were warm without being in your face. Said the people were warm without being in your face. Said the food was good if you weren't too precious about what you were eating. Said he'd slept better there than he had in years. I started watching YouTube videos of some of it was a bit much. Lads in their 60s sitting on beaches telling you you'd never have to work again, and you'd think, right, there's something you're not saying. But some of it seemed genuine enough. The numbers made sense. The place seemed, I don't know, possible. I want to be very clear about one thing, because I think it matters. I want to be very clear about one thing, because I think it matters. I wasn't going there for women. I know how that sounds coming from a divorced middle-aged man booking a flight to Southeast Asia. I know exactly how it sounds. I'd had a few conversations on a dating app in Dublin, nothing that went anywhere, and the whole thing left me feeling worse than before I'd started. I wasn't looking for a replacement Siny Ed. I wasn't looking for anything. I was looking for somewhere I could exist for a while without being reminded of everything I'd failed to keep. I booked a one-way ticket in January 2023, flew out in March, told CRNWRD and AUIFE, NWIFE I'd be back by summer probably, maybe a bit longer. CRNW said, cool, fair enough. AUIFE gave me a hug at the door that I think about. I landed in Mactan and stepped out into the heat and thought, well, that's one thing anyway. The heat is the first thing, not warm heat. Proper, physical, unavoidable heat. That hits you the moment you step out of the terminal at Mactan and your body just goes, right, so we're doing this then. I read about it, watched videos about it. Didn't matter. You can't prepare for a smell, and Cebu has a smell. Jet fuel and something sweet underneath it. Fried garlic maybe, or the flowers they sell on little carts near the taxi rank, and underneath all of that something warmer and harder to name. Not unpleasant, just absolutely foreign to anything I'd known. I stood there with my bag and my carry-on and sweated through my shirt in about 4 minutes and thought, this is either a terrible mistake or the most alive I've felt in 2 years. Could have been both. I'd done my homework before I came. Bit of research on accommodation. Mandaue City kept coming up as a sensible base. Not a tourist area, not a nightlife spot. Just a functioning city where people lived and worked and didn't particularly care about you one way or the other. I found a place through a Facebook group for a 2-bedroom apartment, 1 bedroom more than I needed. Air conditioning throughout, clean bathroom, small balcony looking out at the street below. 18,000 pesos a month. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a concrete block that had a sari-sari store on the ground level, one of those small open-fronted shops that sell everything from San Miguel to sachets of shampoo. I bought things there most evenings. The woman who ran it knew zero English, and I knew zero Cebuano, but we had a workable system involving pointing and exact change, and she seemed to find me faintly amusing, which was fine. The first 2 weeks, I just walked. I want to be honest about what I was doing, because I think some people in my situation go to the Philippines and immediately plug into the expat scene. The bars, the groups, the forums, the whole ecosystem of Western men with opinions about the Philippines. I avoided that deliberately. I'd watched enough of those YouTube channels to know where that road goes. I wasn't interested in sitting in an air-conditioned bar in Cebu City talking to other middle-aged lads about how great it is being here. I'd come to be somewhere quiet. So I walked. The neighborhood had a rhythm. Roosters starting up before 5, and I mean every morning, without fail, like they'd all agreed, then the church bells about an hour later, then the jeepneys starting their routes, the drivers leaning on horns at nothing in particular, kids in school uniforms, women sweeping the front of their houses with those short brooms bent at the waist, basketball courts on every other corner, always someone playing regardless of the time or the heat. I'd come from a city of gray skies and passive aggression, and here everything was just present. Loud and colorful and completely indifferent to me, which was exactly what I needed. I found the Turo Turo about 10 minutes from the apartment, on a side street off the main road. Turo Turo means point. You walk up to the glass counter, point at what you want, they put it over rice. That's it. I had no idea what anything was for the first week. I just pointed at whatever looked least likely to destroy me, and ate it. Turned out I liked most of it, pork adobo especially. And the tinolang manok, chicken soup with ginger that I started ordering almost every day, partly because it was good, and partly because it was one of the few things I'd learned the name of. That's where I was when I first saw Marivic, sitting at one of the 4 tables with a bottle of water and a plate of something I still couldn't name, trying to read the news on my phone and failing because the Wi-Fi was barely functional. She came in most weekdays at about 11:30. I noticed her the way you notice someone who has a consistent routine, not with any particular intention, just because the brain files these things. She was 34, though I didn't know that yet. From Leyte originally, which I also didn't know yet. She worked at a BPO company about 3 streets over, one of those call center operations, customer service for some Australian telecoms company, she'd tell me later. During her lunch break, she came to the Turo Turo, ate whatever she'd ordered, read something on her phone, and went back. No performance, no awareness of being observed, just a woman eating her lunch. The thing that actually started us talking was embarrassing. I knocked my San Miguel off the table. Full bottle, not even open yet, just rolled off the edge because I'd set it too close and caught it with my elbow. It hit the floor and didn't break, which was lucky, but it made a noise, and I made the face you make, and she was at the next table and she looked up. Didn't smile exactly, just reached over and handed me the extra napkins from her tray. She always asked for extra napkins, I'd later noticed this was a habit, and went back to her phone. She said it's okay, po, in that reflex way Filipinos add po to things as a marker of politeness. And that was it. 30 seconds. I picked up the bottle and we went back to our respective silences. But the next day she came in, and there were only 2 tables free, and she sat at the one near mine, and we exchanged a nod. The day after that, she said something about the fan not working, and I agreed it was warm, which was the understatement of the year given I was sweating through my second shirt of the day. Small talk. Ordinary. The kind of conversation you'd have 100 times without it meaning anything. I want to be precise about this because it matters to the rest of the story. There was nothing about those first conversations that felt like anything was starting. She didn't look at me the way some women look at a Kano in the Philippines, and I knew that look by then. I'd seen it enough to recognize it. The quick calculation, the shift in posture. Marivic didn't do that. She just talked to me the way you'd talk to someone you kept seeing in the same place. Mildly curious, not particularly invested. I found that restful. After Detained, after the apps, after 18 months of feeling like a problem to be solved or a resource to be assessed, someone just talking to me because we were both in the same spot at the same time. I know how that sounds. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, of course, that's what she'd do. And maybe you're right. I've thought about it enough times. But I'm telling you what I experienced, not what I now suspect. And what I experienced in those first weeks was ordinary, unremarkable. The kind of beginning that does. By week 3 we were talking properly. Not at the turo, but after. She'd finish her lunch and I'd have nothing particular to get back to, and we'd stand outside on the narrow strip of pavement for 10 or 15 minutes while the jeepneys ground past us in low gear and the fishbowl vendor on the corner did a steady trade. Just talking. Nothing important. She'd tell me something about her morning calls, the frustrated Australians complaining about their broadband, the ones who were rude and the ones who were decent, and I'd tell her whatever I'd been doing, which was usually walking somewhere or attempting to navigate the Gaisano Mall without getting lost near the food court again. She was easy to talk to in a specific way that I want to try to explain properly, because I think it's important. She didn't ask leading questions. She didn't try to establish what kind of man I was or what I had or what my situation was. I'd been on enough dates in Dublin, miserable as they were, to know what that fishing felt like. Marivic wasn't fishing, she just responded to what I actually said, rather than to some version of me she was constructing in her head. We talked about the food, about Cebu versus Dublin weather, which took about 4 seconds because there's no contest, about a stray dog that had apparently adopted the turo and that she called Toto and fed bits of her lunch to every day. She told me about Leyte and the way people talk about home when they've been away long enough to miss it, but not long enough to go back. Her family were in Tacloban. Her mother, a younger sister named Rowena who was finishing college in Cebu, a brother who'd gone to Saudi on an OFW contract 2 years ago and sent money when he could. She didn't dress any of this up. She said her mother's eyesight was getting worse, and they were trying to sort out what to do about it. Said it the way you'd say the roof needs fixing, a problem in the queue, not a crisis, just a thing that needed attending to eventually. I told her almost nothing about Detained, not once in those first weeks. And she never pressed. I thought at the time that was considerate of her, not wanting to pry into whatever had brought a 52-year-old Irishman to a turo in Mandaue. I've since wondered whether it was simply that she already knew enough of what she needed to know. A man that age, alone, in a country that isn't his. You don't need his whole biography. By week 5 or 6 we were spending evenings together sometimes. Nothing dramatic. She'd finish her shift at the BPO at 7, and we'd get food somewhere, or walk down to the SM side on a weekend because it was air-conditioned and we could sit in the food court with a coffee and watch the city go by. She paid her own way. This sounds like a small thing, but it wasn't. Not to me. Every time we went somewhere she'd reach for her purse without any performance. About it, the first 4 times we ate together, she paid for herself. I noticed. I was watching for it, if I'm honest, because I wasn't an idiot. I'd done my reading. Now, I need to be straight with you about something. Because I've watched these videos, I know what some of you are thinking right now. You're thinking, that's exactly what a smart woman would do. Play it long. Let the man feel safe first. And fine, okay, maybe. I can't disprove it. But I want to tell you what I also saw, because I think fairness matters here even in a story that doesn't end well. She went to Sunday Mass at the parish church 3 walked there herself, didn't make a thing of it to me. I only knew because I happened to be walking past one Sunday morning and saw her coming out. Small detail. She had a Santo Niño figurine on the desk in her apartment. I saw it the first time she invited me in for coffee, sitting next to a framed photo of her family. Not a large, dramatic display of faith, just a small statue, the size of a salt shaker, slightly worn at the base. As a lapsed Catholic from Roscommon, I know what genuine home faith looks like. I know the difference between a statuette that's lived on someone's shelf for years and one that's been put out for a visitor. That probably means nothing to you. It meant something to me. So around week 8, I offered to cover her rent. I want to explain how I framed this to myself, because the framing is part of the story. Her apartment was a bedsit near the BPO, about 8,000 pesos a month, roughly €140, about 8,040 euro. She was earning maybe 25 to 28,000 pesos a month from the call center job, which sounds like a reasonable salary until you understand what everything costs, and what a third of your wages going straight to a landlord means when you're also sending money home to Leyte every month. I did the arithmetic. A site foreman does a lot of arithmetic. A site foreman does a lot of arithmetic. I had money sitting in a current account in Dublin earning nothing. 8,000 pesos a month was less than I spent on takeaways and petrol in Ireland without noticing. Covering it wasn't romantic generosity. It was just solving a problem that was right in front of me. She said no at first. Genuinely, I think she was uncomfortable with it. Said she didn't want me to think she'd been telling him about the money situation for that reason. I said I knew she hadn't. We went back and forth for a few days, and in the end she accepted it quietly and thanked me once and never mentioned it again, which was, again, different from what I'd been half-braced for. I met her colleagues around this time. Went to a birthday thing for one of the girls from her team, a karaoke place in Cebu City that was simultaneously the loudest and most enjoyable evening I'd had in 2 years, which admittedly isn't saying a great deal. Her workmates were ordinary young women with ordinary young women concerns who fancied Who, a television drama they were all watching, complaints about a supervisor. They were friendly to me in the careful way people are friendly to their friend's new person when they haven't figured out what to make of him yet. One older woman named Tessie, a neighbor from Marivic's building, came along too. She was in her 60s, sharp, watched me carefully over her tandoori and soda. I felt like I was being assessed and decided I'd probably passed when she told me, out of nowhere, that Marivic was a good girl who worked hard and didn't deserve any more problems in her life. I didn't ask what she meant by more problems in her life. I didn't ask what she meant by more. I should have asked. Didn't. But here is the thing I keep coming back to when I think about those first months. Nothing happened. It was all just incremental, ordinary. A bit of conversation, then evenings together, then her rent, then meeting people who knew her. Each thing following naturally from the thing before it. No pressure, no crisis, no grand gesture required of me. The most effective traps, I've come to understand, don't feel like traps. They feel like a life assembling itself, one reasonable step at a time. And you look up one day and you're already inside them. I didn't look up. Not yet. It was around the 3-month mark into the space between us. Marivic mentioned Rowena the way you mentioned something you've been sitting with for a while and have finally decided to let out. We were at a Mang Inasal near her apartment, the one on the corner with the broken ceiling fan that nobody ever seemed to fix, eating chicken inasal and rice and the unlimited soup that I'd developed an unreasonable fondness for. She said her sister was in her final semester at a college in Mandaue, nursing, which is a big deal in the Philippines. Half the country seems to be training for healthcare, but that the fees for the last semester hadn't been sorted yet. said it once, then went back to her food. I asked how much. 15,000 pesos. That's roughly €260 now. I want you to think about that number for a second. €260. In the context of a final nursing degree. In the context of a young woman who would then go on to work, probably abroad as an OFW, and support her family for the next 20 years. To not pay it, given that I had €155,000 sitting in a current account in Dublin, would have felt not just stingy, but genuinely cruel. Like deliberately stepping on something small, I said I'd sort it. Marivic looked at me for a moment in a way I couldn't quite read, not relieved exactly, more like she was calibrating something, and then thanked me and said Rowena would be embarrassed to accept help from someone she hadn't met. I said Rowena didn't need to know where it came from. Marivic said she would know anyway. That's how families work, she said. Everyone knows everything eventually. I transferred 15,000 through Gcash, done in 40 seconds on my phone. I want to be clear about something here, because I think it matters for the rest of the story. I knew that paying for her sister's college fees was a step. I wasn't pretending otherwise. I knew it was different from covering her rent, which I'd framed to myself as a practical efficiency. This was family money. But I also thought there was a clear end point, 1 semester, then Rowena graduates, then that's done. A one-off. The mother's surgery was the next thing. Month 4. Marivic's mother had cataracts. Had been putting off dealing with it because the cost of the procedure was something the family couldn't absorb all at once. This wasn't a fabricated crisis, I want to be fair about that. It was a real medical situation that real Filipino families face constantly, because private healthcare is expensive, and PhilHealth, the national insurance, only covers part of certain procedures. Marivic showed me the paperwork from the eye clinic in Tacloban without me asking. Itemized. Official letterhead. 45,000 pesos for the procedure itself, follow-up appointments not included. That's about €780. I asked her to send me the Gcash details of whoever was handling the payment, and I transferred it the same day. She cried a bit. Not dramatically, Marivic wasn't a dramatic person, just quietly, looking at her phone screen after the transfer came through. Said her mother had been struggling with her vision for 2 years and couldn't read her prayer book properly anymore. Point 1. No. Honestly, I know how that sounds. An Irish Catholic lapsed enough to have stopped going to Mass, but not lapsed enough to be unmoved by the image of an old woman who can't read her prayers. That's exactly the detail that lands. So by the end of month 5, if you're keeping count, I'd spent roughly 180,000 pesos on Marivic and her family. That's about €3,100. The rent contributions over 5 months, spread over 5 months, it didn't feel like anything in particular. Each payment had a face and a reason and a clear logic. That's the thing about small steps. You're never aware of the distance you've covered until you turn around. And I didn't turn around. Not then. What I did notice, starting around month 4, was that she was occasionally vague about things. Weekend plans, she'd mention, and then not mention again. Calls she'd take in the other room, stepped out to the little balcony with the door pulled to, speaking in Cebuano, so I couldn't follow it anyway. I noticed and I filed it, and I told myself that noticing was one thing and acting on it was another. Because here's the thing about Sinead. In the last 18 months of our marriage, she used to check my location on Find My Friends. Not because I was doing anything. I wasn't. I was going to work and coming home, which was apparently the problem, but because she'd become suspicious and location tracking had become suspicious and location tracking had become her response to that. I hated it. The idea that someone who was supposed to trust you had decided to verify you instead. I promised myself I wouldn't be that person. I wouldn't be the man who checked up on his partner, demanded accounting for weekends, asked to see the phone. So I didn't. Whether that was principle or convenience, I genuinely couldn't tell you. The Facebook comment was in month 5. She'd posted a photo from a weekend market in Colom, some trinkets she'd bought, a plate of puso hanging rice, the usual kind of Saturday afternoon post. And there was a comment from a man named Dennis. I don't remember the exact words. Something like, "Looks like you had a good one," with an emoji which, in isolation, is nothing at all, but it had the texture of something more familiar than a casual acquaintance. The way you write to someone you know better than you want to indicate publicly. I brought it up at dinner. Quietly, I thought. Not accusatory, just asking, "Who's Dennis?" She put her fork down. Told me Dennis was a friend from before, someone she'd known from a previous job, that they still chatted sometimes, that in the Philippines men and women are simply friends without it meaning anything, that I was applying a Western lens to something that didn't require one. Said my jealousy was a sign that I didn't trust her. And then she cried. Not loudly. Just her eyes filling up and her looking away, and the conversation shutting down with the specific finality of someone who has deployed an emotion as a full stop. I backed down. Said I was sorry, that I hadn't meant anything by it, that she was right. She accepted this without a great deal of warmth, and the rest of the evening passed in the careful politeness of two people re-establishing a surface. I've backed down my whole life. I backed down with my father. I backed down with my father. I backed down with contractors on sites when I shouldn't have. I backed down with Cineed on things that mattered and watched it cost me incrementally over years until there was nothing left to give. Backing down is the thing I do when I don't know what else to do, and I think about that dinner fairly often. The way she redirected. Not the crying might have been real, I can't say it wasn't. But the speed of the redirect, jealousy, Western assumptions, lack of trust, 3 moves in about 30 seconds, and suddenly I was the one explaining myself. I've seen that kind of thing done on construction sites. You go to raise a problem with the build, and before you finish the sentence, someone's questioning your measurements. I didn't push. Dennis remained a name I'd heard once, attached to a comment I couldn't fully interpret, filed under things I'd chosen not to pursue. And the next week I paid Rowena's follow-up enrollment fee, another 8,000, roughly €140, because it turned out there was a supplementary charge the college hadn't initially included. One more step. One more reason. Still rational. Still rational. Still manageable. Still inside, without having noticed the door. By month 6 I had a routine. That sounds like a small thing. It wasn't. Made coffee on the little 2-ring hob in the apartment. Walked for an hour through the neighborhood while it was still bearable, down past the basketball court on the corner where the same 3 teenagers seemed to live regardless of the time or the school calendar. Past the Mercury Drug where I'd stop for water. Back around through the market street that smelled of raw fish and diesel and something charcoal sweet from the eyesore stalls setting up for the day. Then back, shower. Sometimes I'd wander down to a hardware shop on the main road, Jerry's, which wasn't actually called Jerry's, but was run by a man I'd decided was called Jerry because I never managed to ask his actual name, and by the time it would have been embarrassing not to know it, it was too late. I'd helped Jerry fix a storage shelf one afternoon in my 2nd month. He'd been struggling with the brackets, and I'd been watching from the street for about 2 minutes before I just went in and sorted it. Took 15 minutes. He gave me a San Miguel and looked at me like I'd performed surgery. After that, I was welcome. I started doing small maintenance jobs around my own building in exchange for a reduction on the rent. Rolando, the landlord, seemed quietly delighted by this arrangement. I fixed a doorframe, reseated a toilet cistern, sorted out the corroded electrical socket in the stairwell that I'd been mildly terrified by since the first week. Practical things. Useful things. I want to be honest about what this was doing for me. For 2 years in Dublin, I'd been a man with skills and no application for them. A site foreman with no site. In Mandaue, I was fixing things for people who needed them fixed and receiving uncomplicated gratitude for it. And this was, it sounds pathetic maybe, but it was genuinely what I needed. To be useful. To have someone hand you a cup of coffee and nod at something you've repaired and say, "Good, thank you. That's been broken for months." Marivic and I were a couple in the way I understood a couple to be. We ate together most evenings. We knew each other's habits. She knew I didn't like condensed milk in my coffee. I knew she slept with the fan on even when it was cool. We didn't talk about what we just were it, which suited me fine. I've never been a man who needed to narrate his own life back to himself. Then, in July, she suggested we visit her mother in Tacloban. We took the ferry from Cebu port, 5 hours across the Camotes Sea, which was calm and flat and gray, and not entirely unlike crossing to Holyhead on a very warm day, if Holyhead had a karaoke bar on the upper deck. Tacloban is a city that Typhoon Hainan tore apart in 2013 and that has been rebuilding itself since, imperfectly. Her mother was a small woman named Lourdes who met us at the door of a modest concrete house in a residential barangay, a neighborhood of jeepneys and children and satellite dishes. She called me Kuya, older brother, a term of respect and affection, and shook my hand with both of hers. Her eyes, post-surgery, were clear and sharp. She noticed me noticing this and said something to Marivic in Cebuano and Marivic in Cebuano and Marivice. Translated, she says you gave her back her reading. I didn't have anything to say to that. I just nodded. We had lunch at a table where a framed image of the Sacred Heart sat alongside a small prayer card of Santo Niño and a family photograph taken at someone's graduation. Her mother served sinigang na baboy, that sour tamarind pork soup that I'd grown fond of, and rice and fried bangus and a dish of achara on the side. We ate, and her mother talked, and Marivic translated the parts she thought I'd be interested in, and there was something about the whole afternoon, the smallness of the house, the food cooked from scratch, the faith sitting openly on the table among the condiments, that reminded me, uncomfortably and specifically, of my grandmother's house in Roscommon. A certain quality of ordinary devotion. People who didn't talk about their beliefs because their beliefs were simply the furniture. I thought about that on the ferry back. What it meant that I found this familiar. Whether I was reading something real or projecting something I needed, I still don't know the answer to that. Back in Mandaue in August, Marivic raised the apartment. Her lease was coming up on the bedsit, she said, and the BPO had changed her shift to an earlier start, which meant the commute from her current place was becoming difficult. There was a 2-bedroom apartment available in a nicer part of Mandaue, closer to her work, proper kitchen, a building with security. 28,000 pesos a month. That's roughly €480. We should move in together, she said. It makes sense. And she was right that it made sense, arithmetically. I was paying 18,000 for my place, she was paying 8 for hers. We were spending most nights in one place or the other anyway. 28,000 combined was actually less than we were already spending separately. I did the maths. I agreed. So, we moved. And now my monthly outlay, rent, her living costs, the ongoing small contributions to her mother's follow-up prescriptions from mercury drug, was sitting at around 55,000 pesos, roughly 950, still well within what I had. Still, just about, rational. But something had shifted that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't one thing. It was a texture. The way that when I mentioned, once, casually, over dinner, the possibility of her coming to Dublin sometime, visiting Aoife and Ciarán Fee and Jug, seeing where I was from, she went quiet in a specific way. Not the crying redirect of the Dennis conversation, something more neutral than that. She said, "That would be nice someday," and then asked if I wanted. Under the same place I'd filed the calls taken in the other room, the weekends occasionally unaccounted for, the conversations about the future that somehow always remained present tense. There was no dramatic accumulation, just a slow, quiet wait. The kind you don't notice adding up until you go to lift something you used to carry easily and find you can't quite manage it anymore. By month 9, I'd spent somewhere between 380,000 and 420,000 pesos on Marivic, her family, and our shared life. That's 6.5 to 7,200 euro, spread across 9 months of what had often felt genuinely like a life worth living. I want to say clearly, I'm not sure the money is the point. I've spent more than that on worse things, with less to show for it. The money I can account for. What I can't fully account for is the 9 months of allowing a slowly accumulating doubt to harden into something I could no longer pretend I wasn't feeling. I wasn't happy. I hadn't been properly for some time. I didn't know exactly why, and I was wary of the reasons I could name because some of them might have been unfair. But the relationship had stopped feeling like shelter and started feeling like obligation. And I knew that distinction from my marriage, and I'd learned the hard way what happens when you ignore it too long. I didn't leave because I'd discovered something. I left because I'd finally admitted something I'd known for a while. That the gap between what I wanted this to be and what it actually was had stopped being closable by goodwill or patience or another payment through Gcash. I decided to end it in January. I just needed to figure out how to do it cleanly and kindly. I'd been through a divorce. I knew how it could go wrong. I was going to do this properly. I had absolutely no idea what properly meant in this country. I chose a morning. A Tuesday, I think. She was off shift until the afternoon. We had coffee at the kitchen table the way we did most mornings. The fan going, the street noise coming up from below, a tricycle engine, someone's radio playing something from church, the sorry woman shouting a greeting to a neighbor. I told her, not those exact words, but something close. I said that I'd been thinking for a while, that I didn't think we were right for each other in the way that mattered, that I cared about her but that I didn't think continuing was fair to either of us. I said I would still sort her mother's next follow-up appointment at the clinic in Tacloban. I'd already said I would, and I meant it. I said I hoped she'd be okay. I said I hoped she'd be okay. I didn't mention Dennis. I didn't mention the calls taken on the balcony, the weekends unaccounted for, any of it. I'd been through enough of the other kind of ending to know that a list of accusations doesn't produce resolution. It produces a different conversation, louder and longer and going nowhere useful. I didn't want that. I wanted it to be clean, she cried. Quietly, the way she did everything. She asked if there was someone else. I said no. She asked if there was someone else. I said no. She asked if she'd done something wrong. I said no, not in the way she meant. She asked if this was because of her family. I said no. She said she didn't understand. I assumed that was the end of it. The way these things end, badly, sadly, but done. 48 hours later, there was a knock at the door. 2 uniformed officers from the Mandaue City Police. One of them asked if I was Ciarán Moloy. I said yes. He said I needed to come with them. A complaint had been filed. I remember the particular quality of my own incomprehension in that moment. Not fear. Not yet. More like the feeling when you're reading a drawing and something doesn't add up and you go back to check your measurements because the error must be yours. There must be an explanation that makes this make sense. The complaint was filed under Republic Act 9262, the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children. Act 1 need to stop here and explain this law, because it's the reason I'm telling this story, and it's the reason you need to hear it regardless of whether you think what happened to me was fair or unfair. RA 9262 was passed in 2004 to protect Filipino women from abusive partners, physical violence, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, economic control. The Philippines has real problems with domestic abuse. The law exists for good reasons. I want to be absolutely clear about that. But the law defines psychological violence broadly, and it defines economic abuse to include the withdrawal of financial support from a woman who has come to depend on it. And here is where a foreign man who has been providing consistent financial support to a Filipina girlfriend, rent, family expenses, medical bills, monthly contributions, can find himself in a category he never knew he'd entered. The specific allegations against me, psychological violence, for ending the relationship in a manner that caused her emotional distress. Economic abuse, for withdrawing financial support that she had relied upon as a de facto partner. I had never struck her, never threatened her, never raised my voice at her in any meaningful way. I had been, by any reasonable definition, a decent and considerate partner. None of that was a defense. They took me to the Mandaue City Police Station. I was processed. There was a holding cell. I want to describe it the way it actually was, rather than the way a more dramatic man might describe it. It was a concrete room, not large, with a metal bench along one wall and a small barred window near the ceiling. It smelled of disinfectant and something underneath that wasn't. It was not comfortable. It was not designed to be. I sat on the bench and looked at the wall and thought about Oife giving me a hug at the door in Crumlin before I got in the taxi to the airport, and I thought, she does not know where I am right now. Nobody does. That's the thing that I keep coming back to when I think about that night. Not the cell itself. I've been in worse physical circumstances on building sites, honestly. It was the specific fact of being in a foreign country, in a legal system I didn't understand, with no one who knew my whereabouts, in a situation that bore no relationship to anything I had done wrong. I was bailed the next morning, the 30,000 pesos, about €520. And then the officer at the desk told me to surrender my passport, that a whole departure order had been applied for. I said, "I'm sorry, what?" He explained. A hold departure order, pending the resolution of the complaint, meant I could not leave the Philippines. My passport wasn't confiscated that day. That's not exactly how it works, but an HDO, once issued, means your name is flagged at every port and airport in the country. You are, in effect, grounded, not imprisoned. Just contained. Just contained. I walked out of the police station into the Mandaue morning. Jeepneys going past. Kids in uniforms walking to school. A man selling green mango. Everything exactly as it always was. Except that I was a man who had just spent a night in a cell for ending a relationship and who could not now get on a plane home. I sat on a low wall outside, and I tried to think clearly, the way you have to think on a site when something's gone wrong, and panicking will only make it worse. What's the actual situation? What are the constraints? What's the actual situation? What's the next action? The actual situation. I was in a country with a functioning and aggressive legal system, facing a criminal complaint under a law I'd never heard of, with no legal representation, no knowledge of the process, and no one locally who could help me navigate it. The constraints, I couldn't leave. I didn't know how long the process would take. I didn't know what it would cost. The next action, I needed a lawyer. Today, not tomorrow. I went back to the apartment. I found a phone number in an expat Facebook group I'd ignored for 9 months. A Filipino lawyer in Cebu City who was noted in the comments as someone who handled RA 9262 cases involving foreign nationals. I rang him. He answered on the third ring. I explained the situation in about 4 sentences. He said, "How soon can you come in?" I booked a grab and went. The lawyer's name was Addy Bernardo. Office on the 4th floor of a building in Cebu City, near the capital, up a stairwell that smelled of photocopier toner and instant noodles. He was in his 50s. He had the manner of a man who had sat across from a lot of frightened foreigners and was not surprised by any of them anymore. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. Then he asked me 3 questions. How long had I been providing financial support? Did I have records of the transfers? Had we ever cohabited? 9 months. Partial records, Gcash history on my phone. Yes, the last 2 months. He nodded slowly. Said, the cohabitation is the problem. The financial support over that duration is also a problem. Under RA 9262, he explained, a de facto partner, meaning a partner who has established a pattern of cohabitation and financial dependency without necessarily being married, can pursue a complaint for economic abuse upon the withdrawal of support. The law does not require violence. It does not require marriage. It requires a pattern. I had provided the pattern. I had provided the pattern consistently for 9 months. He said he thought the case was manageable. He also said it would take time and that I should prepare. Philippine legal proceedings, particularly RA 9262 cases routed through mediation, do not move quickly. He quoted his retainer, 85,000 pesos up front. That's roughly €1,470. I transferred it from my Dublin account that evening, and then I waited. The next 4.5 months I'm going to describe plainly, because I think plain is the only way it makes sense. The process was preliminary investigation at the prosecutor's office, referral to mediation, multiple mediation sessions at a barangay hall, and eventually, each stage took longer than the last. Each time I was told we were making progress, 2 more weeks would pass before the next appointment. The mediation sessions were held in a small room in a barangay hall in Mandaue, plastic chairs, a ceiling fan, a mediator who said very little and took notes. Marivic attended with her own lawyer and, at the 2nd and 3rd sessions, a relative I hadn't met before. A man in his 40s who turned out to hold a position in the local barangay administration. My lawyer noted this without comment. I noted it without comment. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, which was that having a barangay official in the room was not accidental. We sat across the table from each other, Marivic and I, for the first time since the Tuesday morning I'd ended it. She looked tired. She looked, if I'm honest, like someone carrying something heavy. I don't know what to do with that observation. I just know it's true. It was at the 3rd mediation session that I heard it. There was a moment, brief, not intended for my ears, when Marivic said something to her own lawyer in a low voice, in Tagalog, rather than Cebuano, while my lawyer and I were looking at a document. My Tagalog is approximately 0, but I caught a name, not Dennis, a different name. And the phrase, in English, online friends. My lawyer caught it too. He glanced at me. I shook my head slightly. It went nowhere legally. It was not the purpose of the session, and it would not have changed anything if it had been. But it answered the question I'd been sitting with for 9 months, not fully, not with certainty, but enough. The calls on the balcony, the weekends, the speed of the Dennis redirect. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt stupid. Which is worse? The case settled at the fourth mediation session. My lawyer's term for what I paid was a voluntary financial concession, not an admission of liability. I'll tell you what that means in plain language. It means you're paying to leave. The amount was 120,000 pesos, 2,070 euro. Paid via bank transfer, documented, the complaint formally withdrawn. The hold departure order was lifted the following week. My lawyer confirmed it with the Bureau of Immigration. I booked a flight from Mactan to Dublin via Doha Qatar Airways because it was the next available seat that wasn't going to bankrupt me further. I packed my bags in the apartment I'd shared with Marivic, called Rolando to say I was vacating, and left the key with the woman at the Sari Sari store on the ground floor, because Rolando wasn't answering his phone. She took it without surprise, like she'd been expecting it eventually. Let me give you the full numbers, because I think you deserve to hear them clearly. Relationship costs over 9 months. Rent, family support, medical, college fees, the shared apartment, the incidentals. Approximately 380,000 to 420,000 pesos. That's 6,500 to 7,200 euro. Bail, 30,000 pesos, 520 euro. Legal fees, 85. Settlement, 120,000 pesos, 2,070 euro. Total, somewhere between 11,500 and 12,500 euro. I am not ruined. I want to be clear about that. I still have the bulk of what I arrived with. I'm not telling you this story from a position of total financial devastation, but I spent 4.5 months unable to leave a country where I had no legal standing, no family, and no one who knew where I was except a lawyer I'd met once. I missed Aoife's 18th birthday. I called her from the apartment on the day, and she was lovely about it, and I could hear in her voice that she was trying not to make me feel worse, which somehow made it worse. I spent Christmas in Mandaue, alone, eating rice and adobo from the turo-turo and watching the neighborhood put up its lights and thinking about Klondalken. You can't put a number on that. So I won't try. I'll tell you what I know now, that I didn't know now, that I didn't know then. Not advice, exactly. Just what I'd need to have known before any of this happened. Republic. Act 9262 applies to you if you are in a relationship in the Philippines, married or not. If you have been providing regular financial support, rent, living expenses, family contributions, you may have established a dependency that the law recognizes and protects. This is not a theoretical risk. It is the exact situation I was in. The law does not care whether you intended to create that dependency or whether you did so out of genuine decency. It cares about the pattern. Know this law before you keep records of what you transfer and why. Do not establish a financial pattern you cannot sustain or cannot exit cleanly. And get a lawyer's phone number before you need a lawyer. The morning after you've spent a night in a cell is not the moment to start searching. I'm back in Dublin now. Renting again, different flat, same city. Ciaranag is in college. Aoife is working in a cottage. Aoife is working in a coffee shop and saving for something. She won't say what. I have dinner with them when they'll have me, which is more often than it used to be, and I think that's partly because they've decided I've earned a certain amount of sympathy, and partly because I've stopped being the man who had nothing to say for himself. Someone asked me recently whether I regretted going to the Philippines at all, and I had to think about that properly before I answered, because the honest answer is complicated. I regret the specific sequence of events that ended with me in a holding cell. I don't entirely regret the 9 months that preceded them. Some of what I had with Marivic was real. I believe that. I also believe some of it wasn't. The two things are both true, and I've stopped trying to resolve them into a single cleaner story. I went to build something again. I should have built a better exit first. That's it. That's the whole of it. And that's where we leave Siaran Moloy. Back here at Inside the Philippines, we want to be direct with you about a few things before we sign off on this one. RA 9262, the Anti-Violence Against Women and Their Children Act, is a real and important piece. It exists because Filipino women face genuine risks of abuse from partners, including foreign partners. The stories of women harmed, financially controlled, or abandoned by Western men in this country are real. They are common, and they deserve legal protection. That law is not the enemy. We are not suggesting it is. What we are saying is that the law has a reach that most foreign men have absolutely no awareness of when they arrive here looking for love, or retirement, or simply a quieter life. If you are in a relationship with a Filipina and you are providing regular financial support, even modest, even well-intentioned, you may already have obligations under Philippine law that you have never agreed to in any conscious sense. The Philippines is not Thailand. It is not Vietnam. It has a sophisticated and functioning legal system, and it has this sophisticated and functioning legal system, and it applies to you. Check the Community tab below this video. We've pinned a link to a plain language summary of RA 9262 and what it means for foreign nationals in relation. If you've got a story for Inside the Philippines, and a lot of you do, we know that, you know where to find us. Take care of yourselves out there.